presentations. Two will come from Spain and one will come from Bordeaux. The first presentation will be given by Carlos RONCERO. I will inform you that for a very long time, Carlos was in Barcelona, and he's a student of Miguel Casas, and for 1 year or two now, he has been at Salamanca, where he is the head of a hospital and university addictology. Carlos, you have the floor. Thank you very much. I've been told that I can speak Spanish because there is translation, so I will speak in Spanish. What I would first of all like to do is to thank Dr. Aguirre, Dr. DEGLON, for inviting me to participate in this panel, this symposium, and this meeting, which year after year is becoming more and more interesting. As was mentioned before, 2 years ago, I moved from the city of Barcelona to the city of Salamanca. Barcelona, as some of you know, I had headed addiction unit in the Valdebron hospital, and now in Salamanca I'm head of a psychiatric unit, which fortunately for me, well, we have a section and a very strong unit for dual pathologies and with detoxification, stabilization, and ambulatory unit. Now we're going to begin with an ambulatory program for dual pathology. I would also like to explain for those of you who don't know that Salamanca is a very famous university, 800 years old, and really we have very beautiful places that you can visit also outside the university, and this is the town hall by day and by night. Well, having said that, this is my conflict of interests. Today I'm going to talk about medicines, medicaments, and I would like to say also that the study that I'm going to present to you today, the results, it was financed by the Indivio laboratories. And all of this began 5 or 6 years ago when a group of professionals from different centers and from different hospitals, we thought that from a theoretical point of view, we wanted to ask ourselves how much it costs to treat a patient in a real program with methadone and naloxone. We don't have naloxone, and we have a buprénorphine with naloxone, and how much it costs in the real world to treat, including not only the medicaments but also the treatment of comorbidities, psychiatric ones as well as infectious ones and so forth. So we concluded that really, although in Spain methadone is much cheaper than buprénorphine, naloxone, when you include all the expenses, all the comorbidities, all the other things that you have to do with these types of patients, then in the end, the treatment with buprénorphine naloxone was cheaper than the pure methadone treatment. What has an influence here? Well, the time that you have to spend with the nurses to prepare the methadone, which is essentially in many places they use liquid, the pipettes and the electrocardiograms, the doses. You know that methadone theoretically should be in higher doses should have an electrocardiogram from time to time, the cost of the supervision, the transport, the safety of the security of the methadone. So we included everything. So in the end, we concluded that what seemed most expensive in the end was cheaper, and buprénorphine and naloxone was actually cheaper. And so all of this was theoretical with a whole series of professionals. And we met with pharmacoeconomists, and we looked at the tables and charts and formulae, but we still had the real world left to look at. What really happened with the costs or the expenses that had to be made with agonist treatments with opiates with the patients. And with this question of what is the real world like, that is how this project which we called COSTEDOPIA, which is the acronym in Spanish of the cost of treatment with opiates. And that is when we asked for funding and support, obviously, from the individual laboratories, and thanks to the gods, they did help us in order to develop this study. It is observational, retrospective, multicentric, and it is not a double-blind clinical trial. It isn't. It's the study of the real world with two groups. One, buprénorphine, naloxone, and another group with méthadone for patients which had, as a minimum, 12 months under treatment. So patients who were not beginning, but somehow were already under treatment for some time. The aim was to have 100 patients in each arm, each branch, and since it is a multicentric study, and those who participate in studies, they know that you always bring in new patients. In the end, we included 203 patients. We began with 204, but we had to exclude one of them. So we had 101 patients in the branch of buprénorphine, naloxone, and 102 in the méthadone. And this was real clinical practice. The inclusion criteria were patients of over 18 years of age. The average age I'll show you later, but I think it was 46 years. So they weren't beginning with the addiction, but they had had years of treatment, obviously. Agreeing with the DSM-4 or 5 in the diagnosis, and they had to sign a consent form. Although it was a retrospective study, and we were going to look at their clinical study and all of their notes, physical or in the IT systems where there was IT function. The day that they accepted participating, they were given scales, and of course they signed their agreement, their consent. And obviously we excluded people who could not read or who had uncontrolled medical illnesses and who could not come to the visits for other causes apart from the opiates, and patients where the clinical history had to be complete, and patients that didn't want to or didn't wish to participate. Obviously, the main objective was to assess how much treatment costs in the real world with two opiate agonist drugs. Obviously, we had other objectives: number of hospitalizations, resources, relapses, costs from comorbidity. We also compared the socio-demographic data, adherence, well-being, quality of life, and of course, satisfaction with the treatment. We used Morisky Green questions for adherence, for economic matters. We had a protocol which was ad hoc, and also we assessed the presence or not of treatments for comorbidities, for relapses, for overdoses, and care or not of the patients. And the satisfaction and the quality of life, there we used the Verona satisfaction scale, and the Q, less Q, which are widely used questionnaires in studies with patients under treatment with opiates, and which I think you're all very familiar with. So this is the treatment flow. Early on, there was a visit 0 here. The patient signed the informed consent. They we did the Verona test, asking about the last 3 months. The Q, less Q came next, and we asked them to think about the last 7 days, and also we did a Morisky Green asking about adherence over the last year, and logically we asked the patient permission for collecting data with regards to how their relationship had been with the treatment, with the relapse and so forth, and permission to investigate in the clinical history of the last 12 months, as I mentioned before, whether it is physical or IT clinical history. To research clinical history also means that we also looked at the records and notes of reference hospitals for emergencies that we researched where the patient had been within the health circuit, the healthcare circuit. And we included 4 centers, my former center of Barcelona and the Valdebron Hospital, 2 centers from Valencia, the Clinical Hospital in Valencia, and the General University Hospital in Valencia, and a center in Murcia, the University Hospital of Cartagena. So we tried to get it to be as representative as possible without having any bias in a particular place or in a particular region. And we thought that with 4 centers, we got this broadness of view. In Spain, treatments for addict patients, the organization sometimes is the responsibility of the autonomous region, or in some cases even it is the responsibility of the city. And that is why we wanted to have more variability with regards to centers, and we came to a balance between what is ideal and real. You know, with these multicentrical studies, the more you have, the more complicated it is to manage, and 4 seem to be reasonable. And here you have the flow. We offered 204 patients. 1 was excluded because there was data missing, and really we studied 203 in the 2 branches of buprénorphine, naloxone, and on the other branch, méthadone, in accordance with the guidelines and with the indications of dose in Spain. We looked at those with high dose of above 16 milligrams of buprénorphine naloxone, or below 90 milligrams of méthadone, in order to do the analysis. And as you can see, unfortunately, and I'll explain later why, well, we have more patients in the low dose group than in the high dose group in both branches, in buprénorphine naloxone as well as in méthadone. So what were the results? We began with the socio-demographic results, and the average age was 46, as in all studies in Spain, in Europe, and the United States. There's a predominance of men over women, the famous 3-1, 3-to-1. Might be a bit more, a bit less, but here you can see it. And they were patients who had primary education or secondary education, mostly, with a small group of patients who had not received education, another small group of university patients, and there weren't differences between the 2 branches. There was 25% of the patients who were working or in well-paid work jobs or unremunerated jobs, but they were working, and there was a difference. The buprénorphine and naloxone, generally speaking, worked more than the méthadone group, and then there was a big group also without work or of retirees, as happens with other studies with patients with opiate dependency. Many of them lived with their family of origin. There was a higher percentage in the buprénorphine naloxone group than in the méthadone group, but in any case, as you can see, almost 80% lived with family. So this may be a peculiarity in Mediterranean countries like Spain, where there is more social support for these kinds of patients than in other countries. The buprénorphine naloxone group had fewer problems from a legal point of view, and there were no differences with regards to the regular consumption of alcohol, cannabis, cocaine, and sedative drugs, like particularly benzodiazepine. There were different. Well, these are patients. This is the real world. This is not a clinical trial. They took alcohol quite frequently in both groups. There was no cannabis, less than alcohol, as is cocaine. Well, almost half, and very similar in both groups. And Sabines also was very similar in both groups, and this is in accordance with, it confirms data of other epidemiological studies that we've done in Spain. The biggest was with the Proteus study, which we presented here. I think it was 2 or 3 congresses ago, where we included 700 patients from more than 70 centers in Spain. It gave us a very similar profile to the results of these 4 centers that we've included. Well, the dual pathology diagnosis, as it should be, as you can see, that really it was very frequent. More than 20% had depression. There were no differences. Induced psychosis, around 8 or 9%, a little bit more in the methadone group, but there weren't any differences, statistically speaking. Personality disorders, around 30-odd%. So generally, this is what usually get in studies, 60 or 70% of dual pathology. Well, with regards to infectious comorbidity, which was another subject which concerned us because that involves treatment, expense, and interactions. Well, as you can see, that for tuberculosis and for hepatitis C, there wasn't any differences, but there was a difference with regards to hepatitis B and HIV, where there was more in the methadone group. I want to also stress another matter that is a hot topic. 50% of the patients in maintenance programs with opiates that were seropositive with hepatitis C. It was, don't say it in the study, this was closed in 2018, but it coincides with the moment when in Spain they begin to have treatments systematically for hepatitis C for patients which are in maintenance programs with the first part. So probably today, this percentage with hepatitis C would be lower because fortunately many, or some of them at least, have now been treated. There were some differences with regards to the setting where they received the treatment. As you can see here, the patients of buprénorphine and naloxone received it more in drugstores, pharmacies, chemists. This is the advantage, where you're going to have the prescriptions and pick them up at the pharmacies. And the methadone group, most of them were in the drugs clinic or the drugs ambulatory clinics, and there were differences. And other differences were the dispensaries of methadone, which in Spain have never given suboxone, they've only given methadone. And all of this in this field was with what we expected. The doses that we detected that were being used were between 8 and 9 of buprénorphine naloxone and around 71 of methadone, also within what we thought that we would get. Most of the patients were in a maintenance phase. There was a small subgroup in both branches which were in phase of reduction, organized reduction, or programmed withdrawal of the treatment. So what did we find? Well, with regards to positive urinoanalysis, positive buprénorphine group, there were fewer patients that gave a positive result for opiates. In Spain here, this is heroin really, and problems of painkillers with painkillers in these patients are not let's say, significant. And as you can see here, the buprénorphine naloxone had quite fewer patients that gave a positive in opiates. Now, with regards to the relapses, also we found some differences. The BN group, well, the relapse was 30%, a little bit less. And in the methadone, it was about 45 or a little bit more percentage. There were significant statistical differences. And I said before that, unfortunately, the dose was low because the greater the dose was, they were less in the relapse groups. In other words, the patients without relapse had higher doses than those who had relapsed. And as has been published, to dosify and not reduce the dose is necessary in order to ensure that there's no relapse. And this happened with the group of buprénorphine naloxone. With the methadone group, it wasn't detected, but there was a greater average in the group that didn't relapse, but really there weren't any differences that were of any significance. So we studied adherence. Here we didn't find any differences. And when the two groups were studied in a global way, or when they were studied depending on the high dose or the low dose, here we didn't detect any differences. And also we have to think that the patients with opiate agonists have a regular adherence or average, but not as bad as when they have other psychodrugs, because obviously if they stop taking it, they will have some degree or some possible symptom of withdrawal or abstinence. And now to talk about the economic aspects purely, we looked at various aspects. What was spent depending on the comorbidities, and here there wasn't any difference in the real world. Consultations with infectologists, treatments, and so virologists, and the relapse very often was associated to the abandonment of the medication and therefore to a new induction, and that was counted. The induction with buprénorphine naloxone requires more infirmary hours than induction with methadone, which requires less time. At least the method in Spain is visits with a rapid induction of buprénorphine naloxone. So the first few days you have to do visits more close together, and there weren't any significant differences there. And afterwards there weren't any differences either of overdose in the BN group. There wasn't in 1 year, and with methadone there was 4, non-mortal, fortunately, and there weren't any cost differences. Or we did find differences, economic differences, in the cost of the treatment. Here we didn't put in what the pill cost, but rather the treatment with regards to visits to the doctor, with a psychologist, with a nurse, assessments depending on the dose and so forth, urinoanalysis. And here we did find difference between the VN group and the methadone group. And when we brought them all together, then we lost these differences, but the treatment as such, clearly you can see that it was financially more profitable or better when we used buprénorphine naloxone. They saved. Here the differences are not statistically different, but when you do the sums, in fact, we saved around 420 or 430 euros in each patient who was with buprénorphine and naloxone. Compared or thinking about the sample of the 100, although it was in fact 101 patients that we studied, then we would be talking about a saving that really is worthwhile of almost 40 or 50,000 euros in 100 patients, and you have to multiply that by the number of patients that we have. And in Spain now, although we don't have an exact record as we did before, because buprénorphine naloxone is not recorded as systematically as methadone, but we must be at around 100,000 or 90,000 patients that are using opiate agonists plus methadone. And that is the situation we have here in Spain right now. So other aspects, this is not purely financial, but they are important nevertheless also, as quality of life measured. With Verona, we didn't find differences here. You assess satisfaction, medical care, social care, general interventions, care in the center, and here we did not find any differences in any aspects. But when we measured the general degree of satisfaction, there were more patients in the BN group who were very satisfied than in the methadone group, where there were more in the group of just satisfied, and so that is an indirect indicator of a general satisfaction. And by using the Q-les-Q, here we did see a significant difference between buprénorphine naloxone and methadone. So I've been speaking for 25 minutes. I'll come to the conclusions, and what I would like to convey to you, therefore, is that the patients with opiate dependency are serious, as in all studies published before, with the frequency of use of various different drugs apart from the opiates, with a big frequency of other comorbidities and psychiatric disorders. Here we saw with the direct cost we saved in the real world when you use buprénorphine and naloxone. With that we save, and there are some aspects of quality of life that were also detected, which were better with buprénorphine and naloxone. So there were some differences at a basal level. Here we mean how the patient was in accordance with their clinical history, with the family support, the legal status, job status, and then with regards to the relapses and consumption of opiates, of illegal opiates. Well, I have to tell you that the model or the recruitment system was that some days in the week we recruited the patients of buprénorphine naloxone, and other days we did the methadone, so that in order to try to avoid bias as much as possible, and so that the patients had been prescribed for a characteristic that was not in the history. So there are some differences between the two groups. And now I have 4 ideas for you to take home with you, where the buprénorphine naloxone, the direct costs were less. The patients that were with BN, as I said, had better family support, better level of legal support and of work than those who had methadone. They relapsed less, and they had better life quality. So this means that really when we prescribe, we include patients in programs, maintenance programs, also we have to think about other aspects in the medium and the long term, which can be the ones that set what we're going to choose for, or what kind of agonists and opiates we will be treating the patient. Well, thank you very much to you all. Merci.
On a le temps peut-être pour juste une...
We have time perhaps for just 1 or 2 questions.
A wonderful presentation. Just one question, because it's not my expertise, as you know. Why do you think the patients on BN did better than those on methadone? Because I'm sure that you have made very clear that the variable at baseline were comparable. Thank you.
Well, probably differences, at least in Spain, because in Spain we can prescribe the buprénorphine naloxone and the patient doesn't come to the center every week or 2 or 3 times every week. So the patients that are receiving buprénorphine naloxone, probably they are more integrated in the society, more integrated in the family, they are working a little bit more, and they are probably better than the methadone, the patients that are receiving methadone. So maybe could be explain some differences in the baseline. Anyway, we have to think why we choose one treatment or when we choose another treatment. Obviously, we have to think that, first of all, the majority of them are suffering in other conditions, medical condition or other psychiatric condition, and some of them are trying to recover. So this fact have helped us for decide what we are prescribing. Another thing is how much it costs. That it was the focus of my presentation, and we did this study because if you only think in how much it costs the pill of buprénorphine and the liquid or the pill of methadone, in Spain there are a lot of differences because the methadone is so cheap compared with the buprénorphine naloxone. But if you have the full picture, at the end, you are save money if you use the buprénorphine naloxone. I don't want to say that the methadone should be used in some kind of patients. Probably if there are bad compliance or they are under the normal network, is better use the methadone because of it's easier to link the patients to the treatment, because if they release or they leave the methadone, they know they are going to have a withdrawal symptom or syndrome, and with methadone this syndrome is solved. This is a good thing. So there are a lot of things that we have to include for deciding what are we using, but the main idea is that the cost and the money that we have to spend, if we have the full picture, is different if we think only in how much it costs the pill.
Just to complete the question, and on the quality of life or the results of buprénorphine and methadone, in all of these studies, the dose of methadone is very important. And very often there are comparisons with high doses of buprénorphine and low methadone, which gives favorable results to buprénorphine, but or the other way around. There's 70 milligram, which is quite low for a big program, but I think that there too, that could be a basis for errors in these kinds of studies, and so we always have to put that into context. Any other questions? Yes, I work in Brussels as a general practitioner, and I ask myself in the study that you presented, if in the end there's something that's very important, that's the conditions of deliverance. Because in our country, a patient comes basically, is a GP, there's no problem, there's no waiting list for the treatment. And so I treat the majority of my patients with methadone, and there's a study that is, and I made a study, and I had 35 people in my clinic that worked, and obviously they cannot work in certain cases, and that was a comment depending on the different criteria of delivery, that has to have a big influence on the result, I imagine.
Condition of treatment dispensing. If there is a difference between the treatment dispensing in general, and is there a difference between methadone and buprénorphine that could contribute to some of the results?
Sí, la pregunta es
Well, it's a good question, because clearly this is one of the points where you save the direct costs. Methadone, as I said before, has to be administered or supervised frequently in centers. And buprénorphine, you have to obviously make visits with the doctor, with therapies, with psychologists. There has to be nursing controls, but less than with methadone, those with methadone. Of course, how much does it cost? Well, an interview or an activity with a nurse or the doctor or the psychologist, well, obviously, that is where we have found the differences. The patients, on the other hand, who are in buprénorphine, naloxone, many of them, as you've seen, pick up the medicine at the chemists with their prescription. And to do that in a pharmacy in Spain is much more complicated, and therefore most of the patients, as I pointed out, actually go to the centers. Methadone, of course, has to get to the centers. Methadone is an opiate drug that has to be under vigilance, and it has to be controlled, and it has to have certain security measures. And even if the centers are affiliated to hospitals where they manufacture and they make the methadone, well, you have to transfer that, and you must think that in the centers where the methadone is not manufactured, it has to be transferred with certain security measures, so supervision, or even sometimes with police guard or supervision, depending on the quantity of methadone that is being transferred. And all of that involves time and expense, and that explains, as you were saying very well, and that is that depends on how and where the two medicines are delivered. Okay, at the end, after all the presentations, we can go back for more questions if there's any time left. And so now the second presentation will be from Salamanca to Malaga with Juan Jesus Ruiz, who's going to present a study made in natural conditions also on the functional state of patients.
Et le docteur Ruiz est responsable d'un...
He's in charge of a center for addiction care for addiction. Hello, good evening. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers, particularly Jean-Pierre, for having allowed me to be here this evening, and to present this study that we've done in Andalusia. It is somewhat similar to the one that presented by Carlos. And I didn't know the one by Carlos, and he has looked more at cost, and we have done more, looked at more the functionality of the patients, although it coincides. And even the name is similar. Our study is called Andopio. Because it's Andalusian opiates. We haven't really racked our brains very much for that. Our main aim was to assess the functionality of our patients with opiate substitutes, because traditionally there have been a lot of studies, socio-demographic ones, or even of the evolution of our patients. And in fact, we have, which is quite a big study, which we did in Malaga with 1,000 patients, and which looked at these characteristics. So when we thought about this, we wanted to do something different to what had been done up until then. And that is why we thought that perhaps what was most important would be to look at functionality. And this is understood as the capacity that the patient has to deal with daily life, and in how he can be affected by the opiate consumption, or even by the program, the opiate program that he or she is in. And generally speaking, why do we have a study in opiate patients in the report? In 2016, we had 34 million opioid consumers and 19 million opiate consumers, and so it's very justified in Spain. And in the European Observatory report in 2017, more than 61,000 patients were in substitute opiate programs. And if we continue in the substitute programs, not just in Spain, I mentioned also in Europe, are going down. It's gone from 78,000 in 2006 to a little bit less than 62,000 that we had in 2015. And this is for Spain, with a sequence of 94% of the patients in substitute programs with methadone and 6% with substitute programs for buprénorphine, naloxone, because the substitute programs of buprénorphine is less old in Spain. It is estimated that in Europe, according to the European report, in 2018 there was 1.3 million high-risk opioid consumers, and the treatment solutions that were given was 36% were for opiate consumers. And within these characteristics, as Carlos said before, and this is what we have in most places, 80% were male, 20% women. And if I was going a little bit too fast, and one item that I think is quite significant is, at least with the study that we presented in our situation in Andalusia, and that is that, as you can see here, 35% of the patients in 2018 in the European report were talking about a parenteral consumption, compared to 38% of smoked or inhaled. And that is different to the reality in Andalusia, which I'll explain later in the study. And in the report in 2018, we can see that Spain had gone from 94% in methadone to a little bit less than 90, or around 90, and 10% of buprénorphine. The percentage of patients that are included in buprénorphine is increasing little by little. And if you look at this at a European level, it is estimated that 63% in 2018 in methadone program compared to the 35% in buprénorphine programs, which is also very different to our reality, our situation, also in lower proportions in other substitutes. The average age of deaths induced by drugs is at around age 39, also with the same division between men and women, and in almost 8,000 in 2018, quite distant from the figures presented by Ivan. But it is quite alarming. Why are we talking about functionality, which is what we wanted to study? Because one of the goals, one of the first goals that we have when we include a patient in the substitute programs, is to give him, or to get him to get a certain stability, which we call the first response, the remission, relapse, improvement in functions and quality of life and in cognition. And the fundamental objective would be functional recovery, and that means independence of the patients in their daily lives. Syndromic remission, symptomatic, is the absence of the tests and the scales, although there is a certain deficit, and the functional remission is the one that would be normalized in all of the ones that are going to measure our functionality, and that is the objective. The main goal, as I said, was to see this capacity in the patients in the different programs of opiate agonists in Andalusia. And what did we use? We used the scale of functionalities recommended by the World Health Organization, which is the WADA 2.0, and it covers 6 fields of functionality that I'll present now. And once we analyze the functionality that we're going to identify, and we've identified the needs, then we can adjust the treatment and interventions. We're going to measure results and efficiency, and we can establish priorities and therefore assign resources. And as a secondary objective, that was the main and priority objective, as I said. And the secondary objective was to measure, obviously, the socio-demographic characteristics of the sample, and another, which basically was secondary, but I was very pleased to be able to measure, and that was the sexual dysfunction measured through a questionnaire called SALSEX, which was drawn up by Professor Montejo in Spain. I can tell you this was I was very pleased about this because with the data that we've obtained, we've been able to see that the impact in this area is very important for our patients. And I think that we're not giving it the value, sufficient value generally, and we're not covering it perhaps as importantly as it should be. Okay. It's been a transversal, multicentral study. The 8 provinces of Andalusia participated, and more than 70 researchers also participated. It's been observational inter-community with gathering of data and scaling of patients with buprénorphine and méthadone. The inclusion criteria were very similar to what Carlos presented, adult with consent with a diagnosis of dependence with opiates in maintenance, and a dose of stable maintenance in the last 90 days. And exclusion would be underage, to have a cognitive deterioration that does not allow him to complete the forms, or to be pregnant, or somebody who's simply refused to participate. So these are the instruments that we use, the WODAS, FIBAT, and SALSEX. This is a draft of the different instruments. And as I said before, it looks at 6 functionality, cognition, thought. The second one would be mobility, assess moving around the home, personal care. It looks at hygiene, how you dress, eating, being alone, relationships with other people, as well as with the world, surrounding world activities, daily activities and difficulties. And the 6th field is participation in social or community activities and problems like maintenance of personal dignity and so forth. The SALSEX is in the scale that looks at sexual dysfunction. It has 2 initial questions. And what we asked is, from you, since you began taking the opiate treatment, the substitute opiate, have you had any difficulty in maintaining your sexual relations? And the second important question, if you haven't had that, have you spontaneously spoken about it, or have you had to be asked about it? And then the 5 following items refer to sexual activities and the different phases of sexual activity. Has there been a reduction in sexual activity or an interest for having sex? Have you noticed any delay in ejaculation or orgasm? Have you noticed any incapacity to ejaculate or to have an orgasm once the sexual activity began? Have you noticed any difficulties in erection and maintenance of erection, and how you tolerate all of these different changes? And all in all, we assessed almost 700 patients, but once we filtered them, there were some questionnaires that were not complete, so we had to put aside some And so the assessment in the end was done on 644 patients. I'm going to present the data now in the same sequence as they were gathered in the book of data collection, and I'll present initially the general characteristics and then the SALSEX results and finally the WADAX results. And also early on we'll look at the data, pure data, and then I will show you the comparatives between the two blocks, between methadone and buprénorphine, and finally there'll be a multivariant analysis of all the data. Now, with regards to the sample, as I said, all the provinces in Andalusia participate. It's quite homogeneous, but our intention was that it would be representative of the entire region, and fortunately there were many colleagues that did participate. The distribution of the samples, well, we had 83.17 with an average age of 47 years, which is similar to Carlos's sample. And the distribution was 346 patients in methadone, which is 46% compared to 272 with buprénorphine. The average 40 and 6.06 is the average dose of buprénorphine. An average dose of methadone is 42.6. This is usual in Andalusia. These are usual doses. And when we presented the other study also, we got some doses that comparatively, even with the rest of Spain, with what Carlos presented, and with Europe much more, these are much lower doses. But I do want to say that there are no restrictions with regards to giving dosifying. The patient is the patient themselves who asks for not to have a higher dose, and also we refuse to increase the dose. And with regards to the driving license, we can see that 62% have a driving license, 37% use it for work. They use a car to go to work. And with regards to the education, it's almost the same as Carlos. Almost 67% have not reached secondary schooling. So the majority have primary schooling. 5% have finished higher education, and secondary school completion is 12%. 45% are on the dole, and 35% are working. Living together, well, 75% live with a family, either parents or family that they've created, compared with 18.5% who are alone, living alone. This is another fact which, as I said, is striking because it is different here in Andalusia compared to Europe, and not just in the study. This is the situation that we have. What I'm presenting, more than 3/4 of the sample, their consumption is inhaled or smoked, compared to 8% of parenteral means. There's very little parenteral means, and then there are 6.4 with oral ingest. The starting age is at around 22.5 years. And of those who come, 72%, what they do is restarting because they've been in maintenance programs beforehand, and the majority of those that come from having been in 85%, and they've been in maintenance program with methadone. Now, with regards to the current consumption of other substances within this sample, we can see that 82.5% are tobacco consumers almost on a daily basis. 38.6% are alcohol consumption, and almost half of them on a daily basis. 32.1% are cannabis consumers, and on a daily basis, almost half of them. A quarter are benzodiazepine consumers, almost all of them on a daily basis. And here is the way of consumption, which is called a mix or mash, and it's a mixture of heroin and cocaine, which is what is most consumed, more than heroin on its own. Between the mix and the heroin, that would be at around 16.5%, a little bit less of 12% are also cocaine consumers. And this is the description, and within the analysis, the comparative analysis that I've talked to you about, we can see that we haven't found any significant differences with regards to the consumption of the substances, except for benzodiazepine, because in patients with substitute programs with methadone are consumers of greater quantities of benzodiazepine than the others. And with regards to the serology, there's 35.6% for virus C, and those are the percentage of concomitant medication is at around 38.8% with benzodiazepine, 21.3% with antidepressants, and 8% with antipsychotics. Almost half of the sample has not got prescribed any other substance that is not substitute. So we've finished with the general characteristics, and now I will talk a little about the questionnaire of sexual functioning. And that is why I mentioned before that I think we'd been, it was very good to include it, because for the sample, 328 cases, or 319, had a sexual dysfunction. This is almost 2/3, or 63% of the sample. These are patients who have an average age of 47 years with an active sex life, as they should have, and to have this affection, the different grades, that is low, high, or serious. And this can have a repercussion on them, and I think that this must make us think, at least that is how we've thought it, that we have to dedicate to this within the protocol for care. We have to give some time to this particular aspect. And how is this defended? 42% have a reduction in desire, 38% have a delay in ejaculation orgasm, 30% incapacity to ejaculate or have an orgasm during sexual relation, 34% in difficulty in erection or maintenance of the erection, and 54% have been affected in different ways. And this really struck us because it is not a subject that comes out with frequency in our clinics. I don't know what your experience is. And among the initial questions that I've already mentioned, they would be talking about a comparative analysis. If you look here, from taking the treatment, have you noticed any alteration in sexual activity? Here we do have quite a significant difference between the two groups, between methadone and buprénorphine, always in favor of buprénorphine. That comes out better, well, the patients that are using it. And then the second question, given that there's a significant difference between the way of expressing between some patients and others. And this is the description of the characteristics that I mentioned, with the significant difference that we also noticed in the lowering of desire and in the delay in ejaculation. Also, there's a big difference, except for one, which is the following one. Here, we haven't found any significant differences in difficulties to have an erection or keep an erection, and also sexual relations. And here with this dysfunction 37, and with this dysfunction 68%. The proportion of patients that are suffering sexual dysfunction is significantly higher in those who are treated with methadone compared to buprénorphine. If we analyze the data obtained from Salsex as well as WODAC, we can see that a patient, according to our sample, a patient who's included in maintenance programs with methadone has 2.4 times more probability of having a sexual dysfunction than the same patient if that patient is included in the buprénorphine. And if we add the WODAC and we only add the Salsex, this proportion goes up to 3.3% or more but 3.3 more times more possibilities of suffering a sexual dysfunction than if they are taking buprénorphine, acting as protection factors. It is logical not to take antipsychotic and not to take benzodiazepine or antidepressants because of protection factors, because of the fact of not having the secondary effects of the medication and not having the side effects of pathology for which the medication had been prescribed, of course. Now we'll go to the end, to the WODAS, to the functionality. As I mentioned before, there were 6 fields. We began with first understanding communication. This field is quite affected because it presents alteration from a third to half the patients, or more than half the patients, and with significant differences in both groups, as we will see. And if you look at concentration, when you concentrate, or memory, remembering important things, analyzing and find solutions to life problems, learning a new task, understanding generally what people are telling them, maintaining a conversation, making comments. This is an area that is particularly affected. What we've observed is that there are significant important differences between methadone and buprénorphine, always in favor of buprénorphine. And in the second field of mobility, and there are 16 or 25% of the samples affected without any significant differences between the two. The third field is personal care. Here the difficulties are from 10 to 20% of the sample, and there are no significant differences except in one of the items. And the question is if they have difficulties to stay alone for a few days. And here there is a difference that is significant in favor of buprénorphine. And those patients would be more able to remain alone for several days. The next field would be to maintain relations with other people, which goes to 20 or 30% of it, although there wasn't any significant differences between the groups. And the daily life activities, they're quite affected, between 19 and 30%, without differences between the two groups. And with regards to participation in society, that is another of the areas that is affected, which affects 40 to 60% of the sample. And here also we've observed significant differences between the two groups, as you can see in all the questions posed. We've observed those significant differences. And also, apart from this, we have to add another important fact, and that is that almost as important as what I mentioned up until now, and that is whether the patient works or not, given that those patients who do not work, in the scores, there are no significant differences between taking methadone or buprénorphine. However, if the patient does work, then there is a fairly significant difference between the two groups, and the buprénorphine group is benefits more. And this is the analysis with complex scores. We have the same score. If they don't work, there's no difference, but if they work, there is that difference between the two groups. And these are the 6 fields on a graph. And the thing is that we only found significant differences in field 1, 2, and 6, as I have presented before. And now we're going to talk about the multivariant analysis to finish off, which tells us that if a patient is that we have in a substitute program of opiates and they're working, if that patient working in substitute programs is with methadone, they have 22 more times possibility of generating or suffering a dysfunction. And if also that patient is not working, that possibility or that possibility increases to 156 times more. with protection factors of not taking antipsychotics, antidepressants, or benzodiazepines. Well, thank you very much.
Merci. Ce problème de la...
Well, thank you. This question of sexual dysfunction does have an impact on the quality of life of our patients. And I realize that in a number of centers, they don't really discuss that. It's sort of a taboo subject. And of course, it's certainly worthwhile to study that. Some of our patients are afraid to go out and talk to girls, and so we also included the hormones secreted by the brain and a number of other parameters, and we did see that there was an impact on libido of methadone, most of the time dose related. Now, of course, we didn't have buprénorphine back then, but we also had a substitution treatment, testosterone substitution treatment in our patients, and immediately our patients were doing better, recovered their sexual capacity. Now, this is probably one of the advantages of the buprénorphine compared to methadone. It seems that morphine doesn't have that much of a deleterious impact. Now, are there comments from the public on this presentation? Well, if this is not the case, well, I have one question. The level of sexual dysfunction is very high, but you also said that the clinical sensation by the patient is not necessarily the one which is reported. So Professor Montejo is someone I work with, and he says, well, are you asking your patients about their sex life? Do you ask specific questions about that aspect? And maybe in the future questionnaire, maybe those parameters will be taken into account. Well, I'm pretty sure, I'm sorry, the sound is very bad. I'm pretty sure that we have an issue with that because we do not conduct sufficient research on that. However, this is a very central area of research in the same way as when we conduct research on HVC. Now, the last presentation will be by Fuschia SERRE. He's a researcher at the, well, she's a researcher in Bordeaux. I will present on her behalf because she's giving a speech, giving a presentation in a different room. So this is a study on the 12-month outcome of individuals in real life. So same thing as previously. So a group of patients treated by methadone and buprénorphine in France, in the region of Nouvelle-Aquitaine. So this is a study that was conducted by the University of Bordeaux. It was funded by a number of research programs. This was a prospective cohort financed by the PHRC, Mildeca, and also grants from the foundation of the University of Bordeaux. So, as I said, different funding sources by a number of sponsors, especially from Indivion. Now, some background information. I'm going to present very quickly this slide because this was talked about already. So methadone and buprénorphine are amongst the most used medications for opioid use disorders. Studies show that both drugs are effective, comparable level of effectiveness. The availability varies depending on the country. in a number of countries, patients receive treatment by methadone because it's a drug that has been available for a long time, since the end of the 60s, the beginning of the 70s as well. Buprénorphine is only available since the end of the 90s, the beginning of the year 2000. However, in France, as you know, buprénorphine was available very early, while methadone was not available. And for that reason, we have 2/3 of patients treated by buprénorphine, while 1/3 is treated by methadone. Now, we have a number, as I said, of formal studies which were conducted in order to get the market authorization, but we do not have that many studies in real life to really see what's happening in real life. And so the objectives of that study was to describe and compare the changes in a number of outcomes in a group of patients treated by methadone and buprénorphine. Now, to conduct this study, we use a research tool which is extremely useful that we have in Bordeaux. This is a cohort named ADDICT-COSTEDOPIA. This cohort started in 1994. It includes little over 4,500 people, and they come to a number of centers in Bordeaux and Bayonne. And so those people come to our centers and they seek treatment for an addiction to opiates or maybe a non-substance addictive behaviors. Now, for those who accept to take part in that cohort, they go through a number of assessments, and those assessments are reiterated every 3, 6, and 12 months, independently from them receiving healthcare. So those are prospectively collected data, again, irrespective of the type of treatment that they receive. Now, in that study, we selected, or rather in that cohort, we selected the subjects that met the inclusion criteria, DSM-4, DSM-5, inclusion criteria for opiate use disorders. And we also selected those who had benefited from at least 12 months of healthcare. Now, the usual statistics were used to compare two groups, baseline characteristics and then characteristics at 12 months. Now, results. We compared the different subjects at the baseline. Again, it's not a randomized controlled trial. Again, those subjects or those people are seeking treatment, and then the healthcare professional decides whether they are going to treat, and if they decide to treat, then they have a customized treatment plan for each of those persons. So it's very important to have a baseline characteristics of that sample. So 173 persons in the MET group, 110 in the BUP group, average age 33, 2/3 of male. So the characteristics are pretty comparable to those presented by our Spanish colleagues. Now, at 12 months, for your information, and this is different from what was presented by our Spanish counterparts, the average, the mean dose was 89.5 for methadone and 14 grams for buprénorphine per day. Now, the baseline characteristics were also compared using the severity of addiction score. So this is the a composite score in which we take into account the average days of consumption, but also other areas of life like medical, employment, alcohol use, drug, legal, family or social background, and also the psychiatric status. And we see that both groups at baseline were very similar in all those criteria. So we have two groups which are not different but non-randomized. Now here are the outcomes at 12 months. So when we take into account the ASI scores, they all change in both groups in a comparable manner. So both groups improve in a matter of 12 months, and there's no significant difference between the group treated by methadone or buprénorphine. Now, if we focus on some details, especially the changes in substance use, a few differences become visible. On the left-hand side, we have a buprénorphine group. On the other side, you have the methadone group. And here, you have the prevalence of users who consumed one of those substances after the initial 12 months of treatment. Now, if we focus on opiates here, well, as one could expect, we see that ASI distinguishes between heroin and the other opiates because they do not create some sort of issues according to ASI. Now, in the buprénorphine group, but also in the methadone group, about half seek treatment because they have heroin addiction or they abuse other opiates. But in both groups, we have a very significant decrease in the percentage of people using those opiates. And again, this is a very significant decrease in both groups. Something else which is not shown on that slide, the number of consumption day is also decreased. So those who continue and take drugs after 12 months of treatment tend to use less substances. So when we ask a question, what are the substances that you used in the last 30 days for the heroines and other opiates former users, at 12 months, we only about 10% answer yes to that question and say that they consume about 7 days in a month. Now, if we look at tobacco use, we see that many of them smoke in the buprénorphine and methadone group, and there's no change. Studies show that beyond that initial period of 12 months, that tobacco use is changing. Now, there's a difference between both groups. Here, in that column, in the group treated by buprénorphine, there's a decrease in alcohol consumption, and we do not have that decrease in the methadone group. And there's also a decrease in the buprénorphine group, significant decrease in the consumption of benzodiazepine, cannabis, and cocaine, while those substances are not decreasing in use in the same sort of, with the same, well, they're not decreasing that much. Now, the other thing that we also observed was the impact on the quality of life. And we heard from the last speaker that the quality of life and function is key. So it's important, but it's worthwhile to ponder. Now, the scale that we used here is the Nottingham scale, the NHP. It's a quality of life, which is very much focusing on the medical status. So there's an assessment of mobility, sleep quality, social isolation or inclusion, pain, emotional reaction, and the energy level. What we see in both groups, and there's no difference. So in each group, we see a significant decrease in both groups. So irrespective of treatment, we do see an improvement of those different areas of life. So global score is improved. For NHP, the higher the score, the poorer the situation. So when the score is decreased, it translates in an improvement. So for you to have a good understanding. So when there's a decrease, it's actually an improvement in the quality of life. And so you do see a decrease in mobility and all the other areas of life assessed by this scale. Now, all in all, by means of conclusion, this was a study in real life where we collected the prospective data in people seeking treatment. And again, the healthcare professionals decided to treat them with methadone or buprénorphine. And so we checked the outcomes at 12 months. Now, irrespective of the drug, as severity of addiction decreases, the quality of life is improved in all the areas that are assessed. The percentage of persons using heroin and other opiates decreases, and also the number of days of use is also decreasing in a very significant manner. In the methadone group, there's something that I didn't show, but there's a trend towards a better improvement in other non-prescribed opiate used. And the buprénorphine group, there's a significant impact on alcohol, cocaine, cannabis, and benzodiazepine use. So they use less. And this is something that we could not find in the methadone group. As you probably remember, the average group of methadone was about 90 milligrams, and in buprénorphine, the average dose was about slightly more than 40 milligrams per day. Thank you.
Voilà, on a encore...
Well, thank you. There's still some time left for a Q&A session. I have a question for Marc. I'm quite surprised. Well, I come here every second year, and so I'm always surprised by how important buprénorphine has become. So this year, but also in the previous installments of this meeting, we see more and more studies conducted on buprénorphine, and I know that some pharmaceutical labs do fund those studies. So there's a real increase in use. Now, when you have a patient, what are the official guidelines? What are you going to prescribe? Are you going to give buprénorphine straight ahead? How are you going to decide on methadone or buprénorphine when you're faced with a heroin addict? Well, in the French environment, it's a clear-cut answer. Buprénorphine is readily available, and therefore patients receive buprénorphine as a first-line option and not methadone. Methadone will come as a second-line treatment in case we fail to improve the situation with buprénorphine. Now, when we have a closer look, if we had a real choice, well, when you look at two pieces of information. First, both drugs are comparable in terms of efficiency, but the general picture is such that they are similar. That's one piece of information. The second piece of information, we know that in case of misuse of one of the other drugs, the damages are a lot less serious with buprénorphine. And there's also a trend in studies, even if we control the quality, dosing, and proper use, you have less side effects with buprénorphine than with methadone. So taking all that in consideration, and of course, if we set aside the question of cost, because in a number of countries, buprénorphine is more costly than methadone, it sounds pretty logical to start with buprénorphine. And of course, if you're successful, it's certainly the best option for your patient. Now, if there's something else that you need to factor in, if treatment with buprénorphine does not work, transitioning from buprénorphine to méthadone is pretty easy. While if you start with méthadone and it doesn't work, and it sometimes happens, transition from méthadone to buprénorphine is more difficult for the healthcare professional, but also more complicated for patients. Well, I was also surprised that Jean-Pierre gave a very good presentation on weaning of buprénorphine after 12 months, the possibility to stop all of a sudden without craving. So there was a presentation on that, and Jean-Pierre was surprised, and I'm quite surprised as well. So it's true that after a number of months of buprénorphine use, it's super hard to have them stop their treatment, even when they take low doses. So with méthadone, maybe there's a sort of impregnation of the méthadone receptors, and maybe it becomes more and more difficult to wean the patients. From a neurobiological point of view, there's a sort of long-lasting effect, and so the effect is going to last for about 1 month after you stop, and so it's a sort of diluted impact, which would explain that you do not have this withdrawal syndrome. And it's true that after 12 months of abstinence, that's maybe the sufficient period of time which is required to stop craving for drugs, and maybe that's the right time frame for cravings to recede. So I don't know, what are your thoughts on that? Maybe there are questions from the public, but before that, maybe we need to be careful. So the study you mentioned was a presentation that we had in a previous session. So we need to be careful in the way we summarize things. It's true that after 1 year of treatment, some do not relapse, and that's significant. But about half of them do relapse. So this study, again, you need to take it with a pinch of salt. So it's exactly as seeing a bottle half empty or half full. So it's true that after 1 year, about half of them do not relapse, but there's still 1.5 who do relapse after 12 months. And those, and we know that they do need a longer treatment time. Now, the question, which is certainly worthwhile, how can you know the patients that can be stopped without further damage and the ones who will need a longer treatment time? So when the treatment is successful, you have no reason to stop the treatment when you do not have side effects or any further issues. But maybe there's one question in the room. Can you speak in the microphone, please, properly?
The other studies, I guess there was also reduction in opioid use, right? Is this, did you look at the association between reductions in opioid use and the functional outcomes that you evaluated? Like, for example, Juan Jesus in the study, like reductions in opioid and like sexual function, or in your study, Marc, if there were any improvements associated with the reduction in drug use. And I'm asking this question, a little bit of background is because we have a long discussion with the FDA about they require basically abstinence as the only acceptable outcome for treatments of opioid use disorders. And our argument is that improvements or reductions in drug use can also be acceptable outcomes. Now, their response is, show us that that's really showing improvement. And you have those long, good cohorts. Do you have any of that information, of that data that could be analyzed? Or, yeah.
Yes, that's, we're currently submitting a paper where we are examining this issue. And what we see is that there are different things. When you focus on quality of life criteria, and you look at the group that has the best quality of life outcome, and then you describe the group, that group on its substance use behavior, you don't have 100% abstinence. So among those that acquire the best quality of life, you have a group. So overall, they use less than those that have not so good quality of life. But you have a group that has very high quality of life and still using. And when you look into the detail, that's where I think abstinence is, for a chronic disorder, you need an outcome that is more dimensional. Otherwise, it's a kind of yes or no. And what the data show is that the majority of those that are still using, they actually reduce their, so they're still using at least once over the past 30 days, but they use much less number of days. And when you look at the qualitative data per day, they use less per day. So it's important to differentiate someone in treatment that reduces the main outcome from someone for which the outcome doesn't change. Number of days and quantity used is unchanged so I think it's a big issue for FDA and for other agencies and even for treatment providers. If we only measure by yes or no, then everything that is not 100% yes becomes no. So it makes it more difficult. So then you will consider treatment success, a 90% reduction in use, as a failure. So I think in the real world currently, the system sometimes stops treatments that actually work, which makes our patients desperate. Or that, I'm sorry to take so much time, but like we're a small group, or that we will ask a patient who is not abstinent to become abstinent without looking that he has reduced his number of days of use by 90%, and he has reduced his use per day by 90%. We should say, well, okay, that's...
I agree with you that the dimensional approach is better than the categorical approach. I am curious. On your study because I suppose that you. Yeah, I am curious on your study because I suppose that you include patients suffering any kind of depression, maybe any kind of psychotic disorder, because it was a very naturalistic study. Did you check if there were any kind of improvements differentially methadone from the buprénorphine? Because there are some evidence that methadone it could be work better for the psychotic symptoms and the buprénorphine is better for the depressive symptoms. Did you check it?
Yeah, we are currently, overall there wasn't a big effect, but we're currently re-investigating, focusing more specifically on that. Because the problem is that, so we have nice numbers, over 100 in both groups, but when you want to control too many things, then you lose power, so that's an issue. But we have new statistical models we're working on to try and investigate that.
Voilà, est-ce qu'il y a encore une question dans la salle? Oui, micro.
Oui, je voudrais faire une remarque, c'est que...
I have a comment. When you follow a patient for decades, when you have a relapse after 1 year, it's a failure. And I think that the main criteria is the quality of life. If your patient has a job, has a stable social life and a house, I think it's a good way to assess the success or failure of a treatment. Now, reducing the quantity of substance used, I don't think it's the right criteria to assess, again, a success or failure.